To some people, representation in media or entertainment is important, and I understand why. If you're a black kid growing up in the 50s, watching a bunch of TV shows with only white people in them, it's reasonable to feel a bit alienated from your own culture. In that era, television presented stereotypically normal families, and those families were all entirely white, straight, and functional. Unlike a progressive might say, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It's good when a society models what a functional family unit looks like in its storytelling. But black families weren't modeled in that way in that era. As a general rule, black people in this era's stories were servants or comedic relief characters, not really treated poorly by the white cast, but also not on equal footing. They were the happy servant. Again, unlike a progressive, I'm not going to focus too heavily on the moral component of changing the state of affairs. There certainly was one, but the capitalist component was arguably a more central force. The black desire to see themselves represented in a positive light within the media they consume was a gap in the market. There was money to be made there, and I would argue that that money drove a lot of the change. The first TV show to truly show a black person in an equal, well-respected role was Star Trek in 1967, with Lieutenant Uhura. And it's a well-known story by now that when the recently departed Nichelle Nichols wanted to leave Star Trek, Martin Luther King Jr. talked her out of it, saying to her that, for the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day, as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can sing, dance, and go to space, who are professors, lawyers. Uhura, in her position as communications officer of the USS Enterprise, was treated as a competent, respected equal by the other members of the ship. This had never been done before with a black character in 1967. One of the downstream effects of Uhura's positive black representation was that the 70s and 80s saw the creation of the black sitcom, where black families could also be modeled as functional and loving like white families had been. Sanford and Son, The Jeffersons, and The Cosby Show are all ones that I remember watching reruns of as a kid in the 90s, though I will say that mentioning that last one's a little bit weird nowadays. One of the most successful sitcoms of all time was a black sitcom, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The point I'm getting at is, the left is correct when they say that representation matters, at least up to a point. Sometimes, as a kid, you need somebody else to model what it's like to be a successful version of yourself, especially if the adults in your life aren't doing it. However, keep in mind that I'm talking about a period of time ranging from 40 to 70 years ago at this point. This is not a problem that we have anymore, at least for black people, and yet the representation machine marches on. Consider the shit show surrounding Moses Ingram in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. It's important to us that when we turn on the TV, we see the world that we live in reflected back to us. Obi-Wan Kenobi is the most diverse Star Wars project. If you've got talking droids and aliens, but no people of color, it doesn't make any sense. She's talking like it's still the 60s, but a lot of these issues have been solved. I don't care that Reva was written to be a black woman, she's a new character, that's fine. Write what you want to write. My only objection is that the character isn't very good, but people call you a racist for saying that. However, when you start to change the story for the sake of representation, especially for a problem solved before I was even born, it starts to appear ideological. Like, for example, casting a black man in Netflix's Resident Evil series to play Wesker, who was specifically made white and blonde by the Japanese game developers to give him a bit of an Aryan feel. Or how, in the new Magic the Gathering set featuring Lord of the Rings characters, they made Aragorn black, even though black people come from a specific foreign kingdom in Lord of the Rings, and would not be the kings of Gondor. Or how, in the House of the Dragon, Corlys Velaryon is played by a black man, simply because in the lore, the sea snake is described as being tan-skinned in comparison to the pale skin of your average Westerosi, with some pictures singling him out as slightly darker than his peers. And they really wanted to stretch that description out to hit the diversity quota. In fact, Lord Corlys' daughter, Daela, is described as screaming in fright upon seeing a black man for the first time, a prince from the Summer Isles, mistaking him for a demon because of his skin color. Now, why in the hell would this girl scream upon seeing a black man? The issue most people have with representation isn't that they just hate minorities, but rather that 1. Creators nowadays seem to be willing to harm the integrity of their own world building in the service of representation. And 2. There's at least some correlation between creators willing to shoehorn in representation and creators making low quality work. Here's an example of what I mean. The Last of Us 2 sucks. No, I don't care what you have to say, Econo Boy, it sucks. In the game, you can find a trans flag hanging in an apartment, pride flags on lampposts, and a pride crosswalk. This is a post-apocalyptic game, so yeah, it makes sense that these things would just be left over. Except it doesn't! In the timeline of the series, the zombie apocalypse began in late September, early October of 2013. That's why, for example, you can often find Halloween stuff around the game. There wouldn't be Pride Month stuff in October when Pride Month is June. Moreover, back in 2013, Pride was still largely relegated to parades. It wasn't yet common to see Pride crosswalks or Pride flags lining streets by the dozens for a full month. And the trans flag wasn't common either, even at Pride events. When I was playing Last of Us 2, this stuff took me out of the experience. Not because I'm a homophobe or a transphobe, but because I recognized pretty quickly that this stuff wouldn't really be there. It was placed there by the game dev as a way to virtue signal. Last of Us 2 sucked for a lot of reasons unrelated to the flags. The flags didn't make the game suck, but the flags informed us that it probably would. At some point, this sort of representation just becomes a joke, like they're mocking us for having to put up with this shit, and mocking the very people they represent for using them as pawns to make themselves look better and sell more product. Disney's string of first openly gay characters has gone on for so long it's a fucking joke nowadays. It's not progressive if all you're doing is progressing to the spot that liberals reached 20 years ago, and you're doing it so tepidly that can be easily edited out from the Middle East and Chinese releases. The counterpart to media representation is IRL representation, and at this point, this stuff becomes a lot more insidious. Pick any field at all, and you'll find some prog somewhere crying about how it needs to be diversified, how there's too many straight white men involved, how their voices are heard too often, and how minorities need to be placed at the forefront of these domains. It doesn't matter if the people in these positions got there meritocratically, if the hiring process or whatever was colorblind, because not seeing race and hard work and punctuality are all tools of whiteness, and demanding minorities adhere to those standards is a colonizer mindset. This attitude is best described by Audre Lorde, a black radical intersectional socialist activist. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all of our lives in this place and time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. See whose face it wears. Then, the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all of our choices. Everything I've been talking about on this channel in the past few months, it's all here in this quote. That totalitarian, everything is political view, where there is no conception of a private life. Subversion of institutions, with the purpose of dismantling them and building a revolution. Pinning any sort of doubt or deviation from the struggle as internalized racism, homophobia, or misogyny. This is the reason why progressives are so happy to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic to minority individuals who don't follow their politics. Being black or gay or trans requires an ideological commitment, not simply being the thing. In other words, you're not really gay if you don't engage in the most degenerate fucking garbage imaginable. You're not really trans if you're not also a socialist sex worker who spends every waking moment subverting the gender binary. You're not really black if you act white by graduating school, getting married before having kids, or building a stable home and family life. It's all bullshit, of course. It's worshipping dysfunction because the dominant culture is largely a functional one, and they want to remain the counterculture, even if it destroys the very people they claim to advocate for. At this point, we've completely flipped around 180 on what the purpose of representation was. When it was Star Trek and the Jeffersons and Fresh Prince, it was meant to show that even though you're different, you can make it too. You're not doomed to a life of dysfunction and depression simply because of your difference. But nowadays, representation seems to worship that dysfunction and depression, making it more integral to the minority experience than actually being a minority, to the point that successful minorities are Uncle Toms, counter-revolutionaries, collaborators, traitors. And of course, for pointing this out, I'm already a racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, fascist, reactionary, blah 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 blah. So is anybody else who notices the elephant in the room. I don't really care though. If an idiot thinks I'm a racist, why should I take his opinion seriously? He's an idiot. I'm not a reactionary for thinking that 90s cartoons handled racism way better than the liquid shit being sprayed onto TV today. I mean, just compare these two clips real quick.
Hey Dad, this is my friend Virgil. Remember I told you about him?
Not nearly enough.
And now I see why Richie acts like a hood, Maggie. That kid's a bad influence. All his kind are.
Keep your voice down.
It's bad enough I gotta deal with them all day long. Now one of them's in my house.
It's still early. I can go home without calling my pops for a ride.
Virgil, don't leave, please. We can talk to my mom.
What good is that gonna do, Rich? She can't change what he said. You were right all along. Hanging here was a bad idea. Sorry.
Black people can't marry white people.
Hey now.
It's Garnet from Steven Universe.
Kids, don't be racist.
But when it comes to real-life representation, and not just media representation, there's the added issue of replacism to consider. I don't strictly mean that great replacement stuff, though it certainly falls under this umbrella. If we're talking about voting populations in a country getting replaced with immigrants because the native population refuses to rubber stamp government initiatives, something that the left openly likes to celebrate, it's just proof that to the ruling class, the electorate is fungible and should be switched out until they get with the program.
The white British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So yes, lads, we're winning.
Remember the whole Bridget thing recently, where solely for political points, people online really wanted Guilty Gear's Bridget to be trans, and it erupted into a big fight with a few people going mask off and saying that they don't actually care about the integrity of the lore or the story or the characters of Guilty Gear. They just want the good, righteous trans community to get wins over the evil, transphobic femboys. These people are desperate to invalidate cis men's expressions of femininity. They want every feminine guy character to be trans, especially if they're famous, because that means representation and validation and political power. And when this attitude crosses over from something silly, like representation in Guilty Gear, into the real world, you start to have some very toxic behaviors, like where trans activists bully feminine gay men into coming out as trans women because their existence as feminine gay men is offensive towards the trans experience. Putting aside the obviously abusive and destructive component of this behavior, this is also replacism. If feminine gay men, femboys, traps, whatever you want to call them, if their existence is offensive towards trans people, and if you can force all of them to be trans, then the source of the offense has been replaced with something that is positive to their movement. All those articles from earlier, talking about jobs wanting only minorities, and how industries need to have more diverse representation, well, there's only so many jobs or university spots or whatever, at least in the short term. It takes time to increase the capacity of those things. For example, that one article talking about how farming in Britain needs to be diversified. Well, there's only so much land in the UK. How do you propose to make farming more diverse? The only possible answer is to replace the current farmers with more diverse ones. In this way, diversity is replacism. As long as the total number of spots within any domain is fixed, you will always have to remove the old to make space for the new. And if you can expand the system, if you can add new slots, you will always be disqualifying appropriate candidates based on their immutable characteristics in the name of diversity. In order to represent Group A in Position 1, you necessarily cannot represent Group B in Position 1. There's no two ways about it. That being said, with today's "if I identify as it, I am it" attitude, it's not hard to fudge the rules to your own advantage. For example, in Canada's far-left political party, the NDP, there's a standing rule that any departing NDP candidate needs to be replaced with a minority, for the good of diversity and inclusion, representation and equality and all of it. Jerry Taft, a white man, beat out Spring Hawes for a nomination, and Hawes, a disabled woman, put the party on blast for choosing a white man over her. Taft simply said publicly, "I'm bisexual," and everybody shut up. So if you happen to be a white guy in a committed relationship with a woman, and you've got some diversity-related problems, just claim that you got drunk and sucked a dick back in college, and you'll be right as rain. This whole thing is fully retarded, by the way. Representation and diversity and all the rest of it. Representation went from modeling for an underclass of people what it looks like when they actually made something of themselves, in a time where they desperately needed role models and had nowhere to turn, to a farce where everybody scrambles for the most oppression points in order to get a job or a spot in a program that they're woefully unqualified for because hiring based on merit is now considered a bigoted act. Worst of all, this change has actually harmed the very classes of people it was meant to help. For example, the data on diversity quotas in schools is in. When a university implements a rule where black people who are otherwise unqualified are let in anyway, it's true that black enrollment goes up. But black dropouts also go up because the people they let in can't learn or compete effectively at that level. Instead of going into a school or a program that they could actually succeed in, they become dropouts saddled with debt, reinforcing negative stereotypes about black youth. This is a concept called academic mismatch, and although the data has been rock solid on it for a decade now, people are still forging ahead with policies intended to help minorities that only make the problem worse, and they do it because they are ideologically blinded. There was once a very good reason to push for representation. There was a real issue there. And in some select domains, for some specific types of people, it still may be an issue. But this isn't the 1950s. Nobody's out there anymore saying that women can't earn their own money, or disabled people can't contribute to society, or gay people have to be weird, pedo, AIDS-spreading degenerates, or black people are too dumb for school. Nowadays, people can do whatever they want. Hey, wait a minute. There are people saying all that shit. It's the left. They think disabled people can't contribute. It's why they want them to be paid for life, rather than letting disabled people contribute in their own way and have some dignity by standing on their own 2 feet. They think LGBT people are weird degenerates, and that being a weird degenerate is a core component of being queer. And if you're gay or trans but you're not a weird degenerate, then you're a traitor to the cause. They think that black people are too dumb for school. That's why they've implemented diversity quotas. This is what representation is in the modern era. It's just bigotry. It's kind of like Sargon said all those years ago.
I'm in favor of making things more equal.
Okay, but I'm not. I'm making things more free. And freedom naturally will cause inequality.
Entails discrimination. Freedom allows white men to control everything.
Oh my God, you're a white supremacist. You are actually a white supremacist with a guilty conscience, Thomas. Jesus Christ. honestly, this is like